real challenge is not so much to connect, but to empathize with the knowledge that connection is impossible.
This is Writer's Mosaic in Conversation. Poet Gabriel Gbadamosi talks to fellow poet Will Harris about the magical sublime and the challenge of being empathic.
Will Harris, thank you for speaking with us at Writer's Mosaic. To me, Gabriel Gbadamosi. I'm an Irish-Nigerian poet and playwright. Your heritage is both English and Indonesian. Has that been important for you as a writer, as a poet?
It has hugely, but also complicatedly. I think like a lot of writers in the diaspora or who have families split across different countries, different heritages, it's been difficult at different points in my life to know how to access those heritages. And I guess that's why when I started writing, that was my main subject, because I was just trying to work it out for myself, trying to work out how I related to the Indonesia of my grandma, of my cousins, of my aunties and uncles, of my mum, who is very much Indonesian and not really assimilated, even after many years in England, in London.
Your first collection of poetry, Rendang, is very interesting and seems to kind of focus on how, in a way, you could find your way across these cultural divides and connections. Perhaps could we start by giving people an idea of the poetry? On page 1 of Rendang, there's a poem. Perhaps could you start by reading that to us?
Gladly, yes. I'll just get it up. In West Sumatra, they call rendang randang. Neither shares a root with rending. Rose and rose have French and Frisian roots you can't hear. Context makes the difference clear. Here lies one whose name was writ in Bahasa. Here are words I've said in memory of her who I could never speak to. Chandrasari, I call you wrongly, rend me rightly, rootless and unclear.
Let's perhaps take the last phrase of that poem, rootless and unclear. Some things are very clear in the poem. One whose name was written on water. That's the epitaph written on the headstone of the English poet Keats. But somehow, in trying to traverse between English poetry, which is your medium, and this experience, you're constantly brushing up against something which is, in that sense, rootless and unclear. Is the sense that of searching for connections and identity within your poetry, with belonging, always coming up against that sense of somehow there is a lack of meaning or a loss of meaning in the process of writing English poetry?
Well, there's this phrase that Saidiya Hartman has, the romance of origins. And I guess what this poem is doing is it's about the romance of origins, both in the sense of genealogy, but also etymology, and how you can try and make sense of yourself in the present by tracing a word, like tracing a relative back into the past. But there's a kind of lie to etymology, the idea that a word makes sense by its roots. So that's the point of these puns in here, these homonyms like rending and rendang. They sound similar, but they have no shared root, like rose and rose, which obviously sound identical. I was thinking of roses in the flower and roses in I rose late, the past tense of rise. Words which sound the same but share no common root. I think it was important for me to state opacity as a principle, to reject romance from the start, the romance of origins, and embrace something a lot more complicated, which is the confusion of lots of symbols, lots of signs, which look similar but are different, and which are kind of flimsy, which is language.
If I could jump in there, the second poem in that collection, Holy Man, you're in the middle of London, sort of quite near Piccadilly, all very familiar. Here's a chap in sort of diamond-shaped sort of golfing sort of jumper outfit, who appears to be a holy man, but you're not quite sure within the poem whether somehow it's a confidence trick. And there's a phrase, things become meaningless, as though in attempting to gauge this man who's gauging you, as will happen in a confidence trick, you sort of lose your anchoring, even in the middle of London, your home, your city, your place. And I'm wondering whether that is ultimately the emphasis or the action of that poem, or whether it isn't actually about your cultural breadth, your access to many things, your ability to look at things in many different ways.
That's a nice way of putting it. Maybe I see it as being about shared fraudulence, this weird moment of meeting someone who's trying to con you, and suddenly feeling a weird sense of familiarity or of identification with this person, that we're both con men in different ways, trying to work out who we are out of context.
There is a poem in the collection which I found to be enormously successful, really compelling. It's called Yellow. Within it, there are basically two conjurers, two magicians. In a sense, they're doubles. Their names almost exactly the same. But one is a British person who's adopted a Chinese name and is performing as a Chinese magician. Whereas his double hears about him and comes to London to sort of call him out, which doesn't quite work. So these two conjurers, these doubles, one real, one fake, and as it transpires, one dead and one dreaming, they have these performative identities which are mirroring each other. They are somehow twins in a sense, but those performative identities get punctured in the poem by the bodily, the abject, by blood. One gets shot on stage, by urine. One dreams of himself drowning like a Houdini character in the yellow of his own urine. And so it seems to be quite an extraordinary tightrope you're walking between the magical sublime and the abject. Do you feel that that's going to take you somewhere, that great tightrope walk that you're performing here?
Oh, yeah, I guess it does link to those other poems, but I don't see it so much as a tightrope walk, because that suggests a way of steering between things, of finding a balance. Whereas for me, it's about contradiction, about these two overlapping forms of fraudulence or performativeness. So there was this Chinese magician who styled himself Qingling Fu, which is obviously a ridiculous name, who was performing his Chinese magician-ness, his resting on Oriental tropes within the US magic scene. And there was this Scottish guy who copied his act, who called himself Qingling Fu, who was performing a kind of Oriental magic routine in the UK. And in a sense, both are fake. The ethics are complicated. Well, maybe not the ethics. I mean, one person clearly copied the other, so that's pretty clear ethically. But the kind of ontology of it is more complicated, because neither is real. So that's, I guess, what the poem is about, the ways in which they cancel each other out. And yeah, the moment where the body is ruptured is the only real, is the only reality there is, where the magic trick the bullet catching act where it fails, and the body is exposed, the like cry of pain. Maybe that's the one. That's the one real moment.
Let me again jump in to that. So we've now got an opposition between that which is, in a sense, real, which is kind of physical, which is death, which is the body in all of its kind of abjectness and materiality, and that which can be imagined. In all of your poetry, I get the sense of a poet who's simultaneously thoughtful and also elusive, sort of suggesting things, imagining things, repositioning things to try and get a handle on them. But then another thing appears to emerge, which does in your second collection, Brother Poem, very fully. That which begins to emerge in Rendang in a poem such as Pathetic Earthlings, which has a very different scenario. It's a scenario of a strange planet in which people behave in particularly interesting and unusual ways. There is a telepathy between people in which a subjectivity, personhood becomes blurred or shared or subverted or refracted through, what shall we call it, popular, racist, sexist culture, sci-fi. Is there a sense that you're searching for a way to critique the culture or cultures within which you happen to find yourself by looking at the ways in which subjectivity can bleed across divisions?
I think that poem is about how subjectivity can't bleed across divisions. It's riffing on the Flash Gordon film from the 80s, and where they have these, well, I can't remember what they call them. Yeah, these telepathic devices. They put a halo over their head and they can just think to someone and just be in their head, which, yeah, is like a really poorly thought out method of communicating with someone, because it means you can't refuse a call. They're just there. But like all sci-fi or fantasy, which has telepathy, it rests on quite a linear conception of the mind. The idea that you could just be in someone's head and hear their thoughts. I mean, that
I'm thinking of that sort of, what would it be? That phrase, that injunction from E.M. Forster, only connect. You know, across barriers of class, gender, culture, some attempt to sort of get the emotional and the mental running in sync rather than just in and out of sync, as happens across many of your poems. I'm wondering, how successful do you think it may be to picture a subjectivity able to cross these barriers of race, of class, of culture, and connect and make sense and not be simply fugitive?
I guess what I'd say is that the real challenge is not so much to connect, but to empathize with the knowledge that connection is impossible, that real knowledge of the other is impossible, that all we ever have is the other in ourselves. We have an idea of another person. I guess that's why there's a fascination within that first book with all this bad culture, with characters like Ming the Merciless and with Chung-Ling Fu and magic and confidence tricksters. Those kind of flimsy tricks, in a way, give us more of a sense of how we relate to each other, how we perform each other in ourselves, or perform the idea of the other, than more earnest strivings to know, which can just lead to a kind of bad faith projection more often than not.
Let me take you to another poem within that collection, After the Quinine Plant, in Brother Poem, the source of an early kind of salve or cure for malaria. Within it, you are actually looking at yourself, and yourself as yourself and yourself as other. You have a self in English nature in the poem, and you have a lost self, an unlived self in China. What I noticed in the poem is that there seem to be two qualities vying with each other. On the one hand, quinine and the culture around quinine as both healing and in its flowers poisonous, so that somehow the two parts of yourself a Chinese part, an English part. They're both involved in healing, but they're somehow also in conjunction poisonous to each other. I found that fascinating as a kind of model for examining what it is you attempt to examine in terms of connection, or the impossibility of connection, but the attempt to, as it were, find the strangeness in oneself.
Yeah, the poison and the cure, which I think in Greek, in ancient Greek, are the same word, which is where we get pharmacological from. That poem is basically just an attempt to write an autobiography, a little memoir, and I found that really uncomfortable, so I put it in the third person. So it's he did this, he did that. And it's about the way, when you look through that autobiographical lens, these symbols loom up, like in this poem, the quinine plant, which ties together these two sides of my family. So my grandma on my dad's side is Dutch and actually was born in Indonesia, in Java, because her dad worked in a quinine factory. And then the other side, obviously, was Indonesian, was living in, they were in Sumatra at that time. So it was this weird point at which both sides of my family were in the same country. When you put that into a text, there's the overwhelming force of like trope, or which tries to tie all these things together neatly, but you can't really. It's all, or it feels really wrong to, like a sham, a confidence trick to do that. So the poem is circling around that, these attempts to try and reconcile what can't be reconciled through coincidences, through symbols.
Let me take you then to your second collection, I think very well known and really highly praised, Brother Poem, which has a title poem called Brother Poem. First of all, do you have a brother, Will?
No, I do not have a brother.
Which is so interesting. And there's a section that I picked out to quote back to you. It goes, "The first poem I wrote was in my mind, looking outside while my parents fought, my brother hiding under the bed." You can hear, I think everyone can hear the situation within which this poetry is arising. It's a kind of dissociation of self under pressure, under kind of stress. So the trauma of your parents arguing, and that you are looking into space, and the poetry happening in your mind. And there seems within, across the whole collection, but certainly within Brother Poem, to be two things. One, this feeling of dissociation from self, and then a coming together of self in the figure of a brother, in others, in lovers, in friends. Do you think that this is a kind of almost permanent tension within your poetry to reintegrate that which was, as it were, kind of pushed away from you, the self that you experience as one that's very difficult to be, and finding some sort of equivalent, some brother through whom it may be possible to find a way forward, and if not brother, simply others. There are many others in the poem. "Use I or him when I mean you" is another line within the poem. How would you begin to describe that situation of yourself as a poet and this subject matter, this theme?
Yeah, that's really well put. I think there was a kind of splitting I experienced as a child, as an only child, having two very different parents, temperamentally, culturally. And there were certain things that happened in my childhood that were very difficult, and it was around that time I was discovering books and reading, and so words have always had this quality of escape for me, or of a refuge from my emotional life, from my body, from things that are going on there. And maybe the invention of a brother as a way to write about that early part of my life, my childhood experiences, was an attempt to find a more stable grounding. And one thing which has always been calming to me about writing poems is the idea of talking to someone, of addressing someone. Like, I can't really write unless I imagine I'm talking to someone, even if they're not there. And so the brother figure was a way of literalizing that, just giving a broad name to them, this person.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, there are lines throughout that brother poem, writing takes the place of you, for example, in which I can see acts of projection, of transference, of artifice, the birds singing in the artificial trees, the true self, nothing more than the self that's seen, as a process of the reconstruction or the reformation of self in writing. But there's something I want to bring to your attention. I'm, of course, Irish and Yoruba, as well as being British. And amongst the Yorubas, who have the highest rate of twin births in the world, in West Africa, people often say that's because of the estrogen in yam. I wouldn't know. But there's a presumption that we are all double. And there are names for both twins, the first one to come out and the second one to come out, Taiwo and Gehinde, for example. But if you're born a singleton, you're born into a kind of loneliness. Where is your other half? And to that end, they sculpt these two figures in wood, generally, called ibeji. One may be male, one may be female, they may be both same sex. But if one of the twins passes, the surviving twin is given that twin's ibeji to take care of, to care for. And it seems to be describing more or less the situation within your poetry, across your poetry, of a kind of a technology, an aesthetic of care of the self as other. Now, very interestingly, you moved into care work, into the care system. Can you tell us something about that move as a poet, as the poet that you are?
Yeah, it was around the time that Rendang came out, my first poetry book. And I so for so long I thought I wanted to be just a writer, and that would be all I did. And I've always worked lots of odd jobs, but then I actually found it really overwhelmingly lonely, just writing and trying to write. And it felt very narcissistic. I mean, maybe that's an obvious thing about writing, but that it wasn't connecting to other parts of my life. And I started reading about, I read a book by a palliative care doctor, and I started reading about around that. And I'd been volunteering for Marie Curie for a bit, befriending people with terminal illness. And then, this job came up in care, working in care homes in East London, Tower Hamlets. So I started doing that in 2021. It was a lot harder than I expected. So I was doing the kind of social life of the care homes. I was an activity worker, and a lot of that involved one-to-one stuff as well, and just talking to people, but also music, bingo, art, trips to the farm, and doing all sorts. But we went through the tail end of COVID, and it did help take me outside of myself. But I mean, public care homes are also very isolated places, isolating communal spaces, because of the privatization of the sector, the way that they're run now. It's increasingly everyone's lives there, very atomized. They're treated as service users rather than as residents within a communal setting. Everyone's kind of kept within their little capsules, and COVID definitely made that worse. It has been important for me, and I don't know how it links to the brother figure exactly. And it's really interesting, all that stuff about Yoruba culture. That really speaks to me as a writer, I think, or why I've always loved poetry, because I've always seen the self as dialogic. Like I've never been able to write fiction for that reason. And the idea of just speaking from an I the whole time and just making up this story, feels like speaking in a vacuum, whereas the poetry is always in conversation.
I bring that in because it seems to me at some of the most successful points in the poetry, there is a quality not simply of elusiveness, of escape, of dissociation, but there's a quality of care for the other. So in the collection Rendang, there's an absolutely wonderful poem called Say, which is in a part about the retrieval of others. So your father in the poem is, I think, kind of dying, in the process of dying. He has a moment where he wants to send your mother a message, but before he could press send, his phone died. You very much get this sense that there are these connections and disconnections, associations, dissociations, slippages, breaks, but at the same time a kind of flow, so that which is alien or alienated can actually connect at some level. Do you have a sense when you approach your writing that in this dialogic situation you have a kind of duty, a responsibility, a will to care for the other, not simply to sort of just dare using them in your poems?
Yeah, I do. Again, I would phrase it as a care for the other in myself, in ourself, because I think it's dangerous to think you can know the other. That poem Say, I think was, well, maybe it comes down to my relationship with my dad. I've always found him very difficult to know, to understand, and particularly at that point when he was very ill, it was very difficult to reach, very difficult to connect to. And in trying to write about that period many months later, I really struggled. I struggled with with what I was trying to say, what the point of it was. And the thing I fell back on is that line in the poem, which is actually a quote from Maurice Merleau-Ponty, which is, whether you speak up or scarcely whisper, you speak with all you are. So this idea that embedded in every utterance is all that you are. Is your identity, is yourself, and is also maybe the other. And the act of speaking, the act of trying to speak, is all that we can do, and it's not about the words themselves. So that's maybe the sense of flow, break, flow. But yeah, again, they're two irreconcilable tropes: flowage, and breakage.
Across your poetry, if someone were to pick up one of your collections, they will see the poems echoing each other. You're echoing yourself, you're echoing and quoting other poets. I got certainly the feeling that actually, nothing is ever left or lost. It's always being retrieved or is retrievable, being recycled, reinvented, recurring. Do you have a relationship to English poetry as a whole, or poetry as a whole? The voices of other poets, and many of them, from Anna Akhmatova through to Ben Jonson, are constantly being echoed in your poetry. Do you have a sense of stitching together a continuous fabric of persons, of poets, of voices?
I definitely have a sense that writing poems in particular can feel like just an act of listening. If you love poetry, if you spend all your time reading it, then you just become attuned to this whole vast network of voices, of sounds, and it gives you a way to navigate feelings and experiences. So I'm not consciously stitching things together, but I am trying to be open to everything. Yeah, it makes it much easier to write. I feel less of a burden when I'm trying to write a poem as opposed to trying to write prose, because I don't feel like I'm trying to express something of myself. I feel like I'm trying to latch onto something which is out there, these other voices.
In a way, something that I picked up was a love of poetry in you. That there is poetry which you have enormously valued and you continue to love, and it comes in, it echoes in and across your poetry. And I'm just thinking, going back to what you describe as the impossibility of shared subjectivity. Some people, Plato, would describe love as the possibility of exactly that, that our sense of reality is widened by the other person becoming real for us. Before we quite leave it, is there anything around love poetry that resonates for you? That sense of a loving, caring connection with the other?
Yeah, I think when I think of love, I think of not a single static state. I think of a state of longing, of a movement towards and away, and of two subjects on either side of an asymptote, constantly trying to reach towards each other, which speaks to the whole paradox of communication, particularly of written communication, which is that you're turning away from the world in order to face someone. You're speaking to yourself in order to speak outwards. There's the kind of simultaneous silence and noise of written communication as well. I think that yearning, that longing is ingrained in every poem, in every utterance. That desire for like obliteration by the other. Yeah, the impossibility of it.
There's also, of course, the sense in which the other enabled us. I noticed in the acknowledgements of Rendang, you call out your first editor who, and I quote you, had faith in your work when you didn't. Isn't that somehow the enablement which is being enacted in your poetry?
Yeah, completely. I mean, writing poems is always very common. I've always had friends I've shared work with, and always been, it's always part of a network of constant feedback and conversation about poems, about aspects of craft, and and also constantly there are the huge low periods in writing where I feel like I'm kind of going through one now, where you just feel like completely incapable of doing it, and it does take other people to pull you out of that. My first editor of a pamphlet I did, she was amazing. She made me, I don't think I would have written anything after that if at that particular point she hadn't been really supportive, but supportive in a very critical way as well, which was really useful. Like, she just read everything really closely, and gave my work some tough love.
One further thing I'd like to kind of address in your poem, because your poetry, because I saw it recurring. It's Coleridgean, from the Romantic poet Coleridge, in a poem like Budlia not Buddha. First of all, I saw a kind of Coleridgean rhythm, something like the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner playing out. You have a whole poem about meeting a Welshman in a pub who's drunk, who is literally for you that transstruct storyteller, the Ancient Mariner. Is there a conception in your work? Is there a feeling in your work that sometimes you can move into this voice in which a story must be told, in which you understand the poet as somehow seized by something outside of themselves, which they are articulating?
Yeah, I really like that way of putting it. Yeah, the idea of something outside of yourself. Like Jack Spicer, the American poet, had this idea of dictation, that the poet is just there to transcribe what is spoken to them. Though in that particular poem about the Welsh guy and the Ancient Mariner, maybe it's just the flip side of that, is that the way you can become chained by the stories you tell about yourself, and just doomed to repeating them. Like the Ancient Mariner has made this like tragic mistake of killing this albatross, and he just has to go around telling people about that, how he messed up, and you get the momentary relief from telling, before you have to reenact it, go over it all again. So that's the danger. I guess that's the solipsistic trap sometimes, which you fear as a writer, which everyone is prey to, which is getting trapped in stories that you tell about yourself. And then there's, like you said, the idea of latching onto something outside of yourself, which is what you really want to do, to shift the narrative, to change how you see yourself, change how you relate to others.
If I put to you that there are two qualities that I emerged from reading you with, one is, I suppose, its cultural breadth, but the other thing is its imaginative generosity. Within the poems, you are everywhere. You're in a lane in Dorset, you're in a rice paddy in Indonesia, you're in the university in Beijing, you're on the streets of Chicago. That cultural breadth is something that simply, as a reader, we are made alert to. But the other thing, more understated, is that actually you're extremely generous in the ways that you do make these metaphors, these similes, these connections, these jumps of meaning and feeling. And that practice of imaginative generosity is almost the action out of the cultural breadth that you're across. How do you feel about that?
When you put it like that, there are a lot of places that come up. I think I like specifics. I like specific compass points, like being able to navigate by knowing where I am. I like names of people. So I guess the poems end up being populated by specific places and people. And it's part of my heritage, my background, that my family is spread out all over the world. The UK has the least of my family. There are like 10 different countries which have where I would have more family around me. So maybe it makes sense on that level as well, that I am always imagining myself in other places, even though I have spent all of my life here.
In moving between, it's a kind of polarity, the poles of belonging and unbelonging. Of course, belonging can belong to movement as well. You belong to yourself. Do you feel at home in the world?
I do not feel at home in the world. There's a Theodore Adorno line about it being a part of morality to never feel at home in one's home, which I remember reading as a teenager and thinking, yeah, that's the justification I need. But it's something deeper than a suspicion of national identity or any other form of large-scale identity. It's a feeling of my mum never having felt at home in this country. It's probably been passed on to me, and which her family felt in Sumatra when they lived through the genocide in the mid-60s of Chinese Indonesians. This feeling of constant not at homeness, of flight, of fear. I think that kind of thing gets passed down.
Let's look to the future. A career as a poet is a wobbly thing. It's a wobbly thing. Where's the income? What do you feel about your career as a poet and where you might like to take it?
I've never really felt like I've had a career. I don't know. I still get a bit uncomfortable with that word, even though it has now been a while that I've been writing. And maybe it doesn't feel like a career because there isn't the money in it, and those two things are kind of sadly synonymous. But it's nice to think that you can have a life in writing which will not be dependent on getting any money for it, or even being read by people, or by strangers. It'd be nice to just be read by friends. So I don't actually know what's next at the moment. I'm kind of thinking. I've been thinking about those questions that you brought up to do with care, and about writing about my experience of the care sector, and possibly writing prose again, and trying to find a form to write about the overwhelming experience of the public care sector.
An idea, a very kind of deeply embedded idea in the 20th and now in the 21st century, has been the idea that let's take English poetry as a field And one of the first books your mother acquired for you was the book of English verse. Do you feel that yourself and poets like you, the new British, are adding poetry that just transforms the whole history, the whole field of English poetry? Do you have that sense at all, which I had very strongly as a younger man?
Things have definitely changed in the last 10 years. And it's been kind of amazing. I mean, when I started writing it, it did feel like there weren't as many people there was like almost no one from my background. And then Sarah Howe published Loop of Jade in 2015, and it was quite a big moment. And I was part of this mentoring program for poets of color called The Complete Works, and just meeting this whole other group of poets who had similar, different but similar complicated backgrounds, and were trying to find new forms to write about it was really exciting. And seeing a lot of them go on to publish really amazing books like Victoria Adequoy-Bully and Mumtaza Mary recently, Yomi Shode, Raymond Antrobus, they've all given me ways to think about myself, which is amazing, because I don't think you can have any change in isolation. It's always about a community. You need people sparking off each other, challenging each other. You need difference. And I feel like, I don't know whether you could speak to this, Gabriel, but there's always a danger within movements or like cultural shifts that certain people become isolated, become these kind of bearers of a new kind of representational paradigm, and then basically that makes it easier to kind of erase that history when that person like passes, or but if you have the real lasting cultural shift depends on a whole community, and a whole community of different, which is different, just challenging from the inside, not just challenging the outside.
I agree. I've always felt that more is more, and what's more, it's different. Will Harris, I can't wait for your next publication. I read your poetry with fascination, and it's still unresolved in my mind, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriel.
Will Harris was in conversation with Gabriel Gbadamosi. To hear more writers, go to writersmosaic.org.uk.